We each have our own areas of expertise, and this gives us different perspectives and interpretations and motivations. I tend to focus on education. One of the things we do for Patreon is my wife and I post educational classroom supplement videos teaching national science standards biology to middle school and high school kids. These videos are being used in classrooms at teacher discretion and also by secular homeschoolers as well. We do that because I'm convinced that the best way to provide for our children and their future, as well as ours as a nation, is to equip them with a practical, and by that I mean accurate, understanding of the real world. My country used to care about that once upon a time, but not anymore. It seems the U.S. no longer wants students to know things. Instead, our schools want to control what kids believe and what they believe in order to influence how they vote. Texas and several other states have found ways of getting around constitutional prohibitions against endorsing a state religion. Some schools are teaching young earth creationism in science class, and elements of biblical literalism in history, as if all of that hadn't already been thoroughly and conclusively disproved throughout, as if our laws and government were somehow inspired by theocratic monarchy or had anything to do with the Ten Commandments. These are popular falsehoods, often repeated, and now taught to students as fact. But it is not true. These are the lies of a state-imposed religion. Our legal system owes more to the Vikings than to Moses, who evidently never existed, and his fables contributed nothing to the foundation of our government. Our founding fathers opposed his brand of government, and if Moses were real, he would not have endorsed any brand of democracy. But Texas history classes teach that all of our founding fathers were Christian, even though many were deists who openly hated Christianity. And Texas schools also teach that Islam is the sole source of all terrorism. They would never accept or admit to Christian terrorist groups like the Army of God or the Christian Identity. Our history is so whitewashed that our textbooks now omit any reference to any other ethnicity, so that it appears that all of our historic heroes are white Protestant Christian men. And the same goes for any other acknowledgement of non-white heritage. If a textbook once mentioned hip-hop music, it was changed to country and western. The Texas State Board of Education voted down a motion to teach kids the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan, but passed a provision to teach about the violence of the Black Panther Party. They refer to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president who used the Bible to advocate slavery in the Civil War, and they want to elevate him to the same level as Abraham Lincoln. They make excuses to justify segregation in the textbooks, and they even tried to delete any mention of Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall so that our history books would have no black role models in respected positions of authority. At the same time, the board stated openly that they didn't want people to know that our country had ever done anything wrong, because the United States of America must always be seen as a shining beacon of what it means to be God blessed. So they downplay slavery, and they deleted any admission that the founding fathers were slave owners. They replaced any mention of the Atlantic slave trade with the Atlantic triangular trade. And rather than admit that the Civil War was fought over slavery, they said instead that it was a matter of states' rights. Representatives of the religious right have infiltrated education in other states as well, arguing that the United States gave up slavery voluntarily as a noble gesture because they didn't want to admit that they had given up their slaves they had been forced to give up their slaves at gunpoint. In Louisiana, the next state over from Texas, things are even worse. There, they use overtly Christian textbooks, including the Bible itself, to promote paranoid and prejudiced propaganda, to instill and spread right-wing reactionary religious ideology, including sexual repression and hatred of gays, liberals, and otherwise celebrated thinkers like Emily Dickinson or Mark Twain. Louisiana history books describe Mark Twain as a confused hack. Louisiana also doesn't teach anything negative about the Ku Klux Klan. However, they do depict the Klan as respected community leaders promoting morality. Conversely, and I can already tell that there's some degree of nausea happening in the room. Imagine living there. Conversely, Louisiana teaches that gays should be, that homosexuality should be treated like a capital crime, deserving of the death penalty, and they teach that the goal of environmentalism is not to preserve our natural resources for the sake of our heirs, but rather to destroy the economies of the world's richest nations. That's why they advocate electric cars and plastic recycling and solar power. It's all part of a fiendish plan that makes no sense at all. But then, Louisiana's public schools also teach that dinosaurs lived alongside people just like in the Flintstones. And Louisiana's science textbooks, one of them, actually teaches that the dinosaurs breathed fire. And Louisiana schools teach that the existence of the Loch Ness Monster disproves evolution. American schools no longer care about education, but indoctrination, inculcation. And that's the difference between a belief system with required beliefs and prohibited beliefs and free thought. Free thinkers would rather teach kids what or how to think rather than what to think. But the ideologues who've seized control of education legislation want to control what they believe, and they don't want kids to question that. That's why in 2012, the Texas Republican Party platform admitted that they are against critical thinking, that they are opposed to higher order thinking skills that might challenge a student's fixed beliefs. And of course, a fixed belief is one that is imposed or programmed into the developing mind of a susceptible child as an unquestionable conclusion which cannot be reasoned with and will not be corrected even if it is proven wrong. So our students are being deliberately, systematically deceived through misinformation, misrepresentation, and manipulation of the facts. And we're talking about state-endorsed and politically imposed idiocy designed to stupefy the student and further politicize the classroom. And it's not like this is a secret. It's all over mainstream media. They even made a movie about it called The Revisionaries. So everybody knows that this is going on. And I am stunned when lawyers tell me that it would be a labor-intensive case to sue the state. I think, or I would think, that we have a moral obligation to teach only what we can show to be actually factually correct, and that this should come without any perceptible political bias and without apology for those who wish to deny reality for religious reasons. Now, if you cite religion as your justification for any action or position, then you have not given a reason and are not justified. Of course, the dumbing down of American students has been going on for a long time before the newspapers began to report it. 46 to 52% of Americans now believe in young earth creationism. How can that be? George Carlin said to look at how stupid the average person is and remember that half the population is stupider than that. So that explains that demographic. Now, think about how stupid y'all are. Smart people know how stupid they are. And if you're in this room, you're probably one of the smart ones. But that also means that you're about as good as it gets. Now you see the problem. If you can't solve the world's problems, do you think the next generation can? Don't count on it, because recent studies show that the parents of today's students, ignorant though we are better educated than our descendants. The most recent published report of 34 countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Program for International Student Assessment, revealed that the United States ranked below average across the board, from 17th place in reading down to 27th place in science. The report said that Americans have particular difficulty with real-world problems. By that, they meant that we can't interpret real-world situations in mathematical terms, but several of you understand that our problem with real-world problems is not limited to mathematics, but to a lot of other things that just don't add up. Since we're in Canada, I will congratulate our hosts on your mean ranking of 13th place among developed nations. You're doing better than we are. But the top 7 slots are all in the Orient. That's Singapore, Korea, Japan, and 4 places being ruled by China, who has the top position. So they will have the better economy, not us. The New York Times says that they have more honors kids than we have kids. And what we have is an idiocracy, where most people are ignorant, apathetic, incurious, and proud of that. Even right-wingers realize and admit how poorly American students are doing on the world stage, and they use this as an excuse to cut education even further. The United States has just released a new budget, one that has the lowest allowance for education since the recession, and the lowest funding for science since World War II, but a higher allotment for the military than ever before, and that reportedly will consume 80% of individual tax revenue. The less we invest in improving understanding, the worse our economy gets. And the worse our economy gets, the more we spend on the military. Because we are no longer the land of the free and the home of the brave. We are the ones who will sacrifice our freedoms out of fear. If America wanted to be as great as we pretend to be, then the military wouldn't be such a necessity, and the advancement of math and science education would be a priority. But as it is, we're the butt of jokes. My wife and I were on the train from Glasgow to Edinburgh, listening to Scottish passengers laughing about one of our Republican congressmen from Tennessee. And this is the advocate of family values and abstinence-only sex education, who pressured his wife into getting an abortion, and then pressured his mistress into getting an abortion, before he realized that his underage daughter was pregnant after having an affair with a married man. Do you see what ignorant, arrogant, amoral hypocrites we look like to the rest of the world? I sat silent on that train. I didn't want to say anything for fear of anybody recognizing my accent. And then we got to Edinburgh, and there was a street performer juggling clubs. And he said, and this is how they do it in America. And then he laid them all down on the ground and with one hand started redistributing them. And then he looked up and he said, are there any Americans here? Of course, I raised my hand. And he says, oh, I'm sorry. I'll do it again, only slower. That's right. We live in an age where the Scots make fun of us. And it's justified. Because just last week, the Minister for Education in Scotland said that creationism is not a scientific principle and is not a viable alternative to evolution, so Scotland passed a law against teaching creationism in public school. And a week before that, Ireland legalized same-sex marriage. It's a sad day for me when Ireland is more progressive and less sexually repressed than we are. No wonder everybody makes fun of us. So my first video on the foundational falsehoods of creationism featured scenes from an Australian talk show making fun of how stupid Americans are. And it was the same thing that Jay Leno used to do with his street walking bit. He would interview people on the street, ask questions everybody should know the answers to, and then discover how uncommon common knowledge really is. But how many of those people didn't make it on TV because they actually knew the answer? Well, just to see how stupid we really are, the National Foundation conducted a poll of 2,200 Americans in 2012, and they discovered that 26% of us don't know if the Earth goes around the sun or vice versa. And of those who got it right, barely half were able to tell that the Earth takes 1 year to complete an orbit as opposed to a month or a day, which was the most common wrong answer. Now, I've seen other surveys where the average man on the street has no idea how old the Earth is or how it formed, and then one, they ask somebody, how many moons does the Earth have? He said 8. I have to wonder if one of the moons he was thinking of is called Venus. This is a geocentric chart of the solar system. I have met people who think that this is how it is. My own grandmother, for example, believed that the Earth was the biggest thing in the universe, that the sun and the other planets were all about the same size as the moon, and that the stars were tiny twinkling things that occasionally fell out of the sky. And a friend of mine went to the Ozarks, and he was complaining that the people there said that the stars were just lights in the sky. So when you find yourself trying to reason with a deeply religious person, and they talk about how ridiculous it is to imagine that all of this happened by chance, it might be that this is the model that they're working from. Because you have to admit, that looks like it was designed on purpose. That couldn't have happened by accident. You know, in the mindset of such a person, there's not just 8 or 9 planets out there. There could be many more, just like in the cartoon about Duck Dodgers in the 24th and a half century. There are people out there who think that this is how space is. Remember, all these planets are supposed to go around the sun, and there are mainstream Christians out there who think that this is the solar system. Now, geocentrists will get a little squirrely about the bright glowing area in the middle of this false color photograph. But a lot of other people think that's the sun, and that the Earth is one of these larger orbs, one of these hundreds of larger orbs spinning around it. And of course, the tiny little bits of glitter, those are the stars. And when I started getting involved in online arguments, I often happened across people who didn't know the difference between a solar system and a galaxy. And for those people, this is both. And the universe at the same time. Solar system, galaxy, universe is only one. And we're, of course, in the middle of it. Now, a lot of seemingly intelligent people don't realize that our sun would be one of a couple billion in this image, and so small that it wouldn't even be a dot. That every pixel in this glowing blue band represents the light of multiple suns at once, seen as if they were microscopic from this distance. And even when you can find religious believers who seem to understand that the sun is just another star, and how many sun stars there are in a galaxy, and how many galaxies there are in the universe, you would expect that the sheer breadth and scope of that should inspire awe. And as often as we say the word awesome, we seldom use it correctly. Oprah Winfrey says that atheists can't experience awe or wonder, a statement that bothers a crap out of me. Of course, I disagree. In order to be impressed by anything, you have to have something to compare it to, and this exceeds all metrics. without having to make up something else, something cheap and stupid and simple like a God, and then have to exaggerate that too, just trying to keep up. Yet, even if you can find some believer who understands all of this, they may argue that the entire universe of perhaps hundreds of billions of galaxies somehow orbits around the Earth. I have actually seen Christian apologists argue that the Earth, or at least our solar system, somehow lies at the center and the beginning of everything. It has to, if you're going to pretend that any of the holy books are worth the price of a paperback. Genesis 1 says God spent 4 days forming the earth, raising land, making plants and animals and all that, and after 4 days of working on this one speck of cosmic dust, he sneezed out the entirety of the rest of the cosmos all at once, and then had to go back to work on this one planet because it still wasn't done yet. And that means that, according to the story, that the Earth, there was a time when the Earth was the only thing in the universe, and it had to be the biggest and most complicated thing in the world because it took God 5 times longer to work on this one planet than it did to conjure every other world around billions of stars within each of the billions of galaxies. And according to the fables in the Bible, the sun, the moon, and the stars, the sun and the moon are both lights, and the stars are something different than the sun, and what they are is not possible. According to the book of Daniel, the world is flat, and the stars are tiny things that can be knocked out of the sky and trampled on. One book of the Bible says that the stars can be blown out of the heavens by storms on the earth, and Judges 5:20 has a group of stars ganging up on one man to do battle with him. He's butch. So the stars are alive now too. The Quran also describes the earth as flat, like a map, where the mountains are like paperweights or pegs that hold the map down flat. And the Quran says again and again and again that the earth and the moon both orbit the earth. Did I say the sun and the moon? Yeah, the sun and the moon both orbit the earth, but that the earth itself never moves. Clearly, the authors of the Bible and of the Quran had no idea what the sun or the moon or the stars even are. It is painfully obvious that all those legends were written from the perspective of primitives, ignorant of the very world they're on. Now, if the Bible is to be interpreted literally, then it is clear that the authors believed that the world was flat, the way it is described in Daniel 4, 10, 11, that it is spread out like a map over a flat disk. Not a sphere, but a circle, as described in Isaiah 40, 22. Isaiah 11:12 describes it as being divided into 4 quadrants, sometimes mistranslated as corners. And according to 1 Samuel 2:8, this disk world stood on pillars like a table, so that it would not move, because Psalms 93:1 and Chronicles 16:30 said that it could not be moved. This tabletop world was then submerged in a watery abyss and covered by what Ezekiel 1:22 described as a giant, transparent crystal dome. This is the firmament from Genesis 1:7. So the earth is like a snow globe. According to Genesis 1:14, the sun, moon, and stars are contained within the expanse of this massive dome. Genesis 7:11 says that fountains will allow water in from below the firmament, and windows in the expanse of the firmament will allow rain in also. This is not an original idea. This was a common belief across Asia, regardless of religion, but it was still wrong. Some Persians at that time said that the god Mithras had the stars sewn into the lining of his cloak, which he would drape over this crystalline firmament to bring on the night, and Psalms 104:2 describes the same thing. 1 Samuel 2:8 says that there are pillars holding the earth above the deep, but there are no pillars, and there is no deep, because Genesis 1:6-8 is wrong. Outer space is not full of water. Many of these stories are literally fairy tales by definition, and we are talking about people who still believe in giants, witches, dragons, spells and curses, magical anthropomorphic immortals, hordes of reanimated corpses, and animals who talk and act like people. Of worldwide flood that we know didn't happen, A firmament that can't be real? And how about a supposed savior whose life story matches that of a dozen older myths from different religions and neighboring regions, but who doesn't match the prophecies he was supposed to fulfill? Where we're supposed to believe that everybody spoke the same language until 3,700 years ago, even though we know better and can prove it? Or that millions of slaves followed a god out of Egypt and somehow took 40 years to walk a distance that should have taken 2 weeks if they followed the coastline instead? How's that for divine guidance? You would think that if there actually was a God and he cared about sharing anything with us that we could honestly call truth, that there would be some portions of the Bible that would be verifiably accurate verbatim and not the same preposterous nonsense that everybody else believes in all of the other religions that men have ever imagined. The reason that all of this is wrong is because it is a belief in magic, which shares the same definition as miracle. An event that cannot be explained by science because it defies the laws of physics, being brought about by the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural events. Now, in my humble opinion, gods and magic are the most infantile excuses men have ever made up to explain anything, and of course it doesn't explain anything. Miraculous magic isn't even an attempt to explain anything because faith isn't about understanding things. Faith is about make-believe. It's the power of pretend. Dr. Peter Boghossian, professor of philosophy specializing in epistemology, who will be here tomorrow, described faith the same way that I did in my video series. He and I both say that faith is pretending to know what you don't know, and forgetting for the moment that a God cannot realistically exist, because, think about it, really? His mind exists independent of a brain, and he has telekinetic powers to intricately manipulate every aspect of everybody's life so that we're all just characters in a movie that God is making? As if we all live in the Twilight Zone and God is Rod Serling? So that you're supposed to think that the most important entity imaginable is always watching you, even when you're in the toilet. How could we imagine an invisible man who magically, by an incantation spell no less, let there be, created hundreds of billions of galaxies and exists in all of them simultaneously across a range of 78 billion light years, yet he gets upset when defective people come too close to his temple? According to Leviticus, the most repugnant book of the Bible, no one with any defect can offer a sacrifice unto the Lord. No one who is blind or lame or has a flat nose or a superfluous growth or a broken hand or a broken foot. If you're a hunchback or a dwarf, or if you have a blemish in your eye, or if you have scars, scabs, scabies, scurvy, if your penis has been cut off, you're cut off from God. If your testicles have been crushed, I don't even want to know what that looks like, and neither does God, so don't go near his temple. He can't do anything about that. He doesn't want to see that, and he can't fix it anyway. God can't cure those things. No faith healer can. This is El, Allah, Abba, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, the guy who called for blood sacrifice of all the firstborn males, the guy who blames children for the actions of their distant ancestors, and who is very concerned that you might enjoy sex, maybe with the wrong partner or with no partner. Either one is a stoning offense. According to the Bible and the right-wingers, the religious right in my country, homosexuality is a capital crime worthy of the death penalty. But fondling your baby sisters is easily forgivable because the Bible endorses incest and child molestation and says that women are just property anyway, and slavery is okay too because God doesn't care about human rights violations. He's more concerned that you might eat bacon or lobster or boil a baby goat in its own mother's milk or Mix cotton and polyester, a legitimate concern, to be sure. And God is so insistent that we cut off our foreskins that you have to wonder why he gave us all foreskins to begin with. Do you remember when do you remember when God was going to kill Moses over foreskin? In the Bible, they traded foreskins like currency. Do you remember when Saul demanded 100 Philistine foreskins as a dowry? He didn't want money. He wanted him some penis skins. It makes you wonder what he's into. And what does a bag of penis skins look like? Maybe it's because I'm from the South, but that story gives me a very disturbing image in my mind. Now, anybody here watch Doctor Who? All right, well, do you ever wonder why it is this guy can visit any planet in the cosmos at any point in history? So why is he always in southern England around the turn of the 21st century? The same thing with God. He's an uber-galactic overlord with an infinite reign over a jillion worlds, yet he's forever fixated with one tribe of desert bandits on one tiny patch of this one planet. And he hasn't done anything since the Iron Age because chariots proved to be too much for him. The ultimate power in the universe, thwarted by the most primitive of human technology. And even if we pretend that the Bible is God's word, he never told us anything that turned out to be true. God really is one of those things that will go away if we stop thinking about it. So religious people want us all to believe impossible nonsense for no good reason, under the threat of death or the threat of a fate worse than death. And this is the ultimate joke in this. You're not judged by how good or bad you are. It doesn't matter how evil you are. All sins will be forgiven if you but believe. But if you don't believe, it doesn't matter how good you are. Because the only sin that will not be forgiven is disbelief. And that means that gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption. And remember, God demands obedience, but not so much directly to him, but rather to the people claiming to do his work. And this is where it's important to remember that God can create dinosaurs and viruses and everything that humans can't make, but he can't make anything humans can make. He can't create a box or a boat or a building. So he has to give very specific instructions for how we are supposed to provide for all those people who pretend that he put them in charge. And that's what this is really all about. In the last 3 months, I've been to Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Norway, Iceland, and an alarming thing is that I've heard that in the most recent elections, conservative parties have seized power in most or all of these places, even here in Canada, from what I've heard. But if your leaders are like ours, and they've bought into this fairy tale belief system and are basing their judgments and their prejudice on that, then they're not going to see the big picture, because they prefer a petty deity.